Hello and welcome back to another video. Today I thought I would recommend a book for every single genre, or at least every single one I've read something from, because I want to have some sort of custom recommendation for every age and each genre. And then I also want to do a more well-known book that I'd recommend, and if I can, a more obscure one. For the genres that I've read more of, like fantasy or romance, then that'll be a lot easier. But for genres like historical fiction or memoirs, I'll just have to share the ones that I've already read. I'm definitely most at home with genres like fantasy and realistic fiction and romance. However, I have been reading some different books recently that I have enjoyed quite a lot. However, I'm going to start off with fantasy, and I'm going to give a middle grade recommendation. So, you've probably heard of Percy Jackson, and it's likely that you've already read it because it is so popular and so well known. But I just wanted to reiterate that it is actually a really good series. What's nice about it is that there are like 3 series that have the Percy Jackson world in it, and you can just stop after each one individually if you're just comfortable with the first series. But if you do really love it, then you can move on to the next one, because it's Percy Jackson, then Heroes of Olympus, and then the Trials of Apollo. And you get to see some of your old characters in each of the following series. So I thought that was really nice. And then there are also 2 movies that are okay, and a series that came out recently if you do really get into this. However, for a recommendation it's fairly well known, but it doesn't have that many Goodreads ratings, is Keeper of the Lost Cities by Shannon Messenger. And this is probably one of my all-time favourite series. It is this fantasy series about a girl who finds out she is an elf and is sent to live in this magical world called the Lost Cities. And mysteries unravel and it becomes dangerous, and it's just such an incredible story. This series definitely got me obsessed with fantasy, and I would definitely recommend it. For a young adult recommendation for fantasy, I'd recommend The Young Elites, which is quite popular, and I describe this book as the opposite of a redemption arc type story. You get a really unique main character called Adelina, and she's in this world where there was like an infection or something, or a disease a while ago, and it makes people have magic and a scar that shows it. It's a really interesting, fun story, and it's a trilogy. Next, I would recommend, for a less well-known one, Everless, which is this story where currency is time, as in time of your life. So you pay for things in minutes, hours, days of your life by giving it to other people who can absorb it to live forever. The concept's really fun and the first book's really good, but I did find myself getting bored on the second one. So if you want to read the whole series, I'm not sure about that, but the first one's fun. It doesn't have a whole conclusion at the end, but I just feel satisfied after reading it. And then I can hardly mention fantasy without mentioning Brandon Sanderson. I really loved Mistborn, which is one of his more famous adult fantasy series. And I haven't actually continued it yet. I've only read the first one, but that's just because I've had so many other books to read, and I'm definitely going to continue it. And it's about this world where you have the Scar, who are the working class, the poor, the slaves. And then you have these nobility that can have these magical powers with this really unique magic system. I'm not going to go too far into it, but because I don't want to spoil anything, but I definitely recommend this series. Brandon Sanderson is known as the fantasy king for a reason. Moving on to romance. For a young adult, I'd recommend Check and Mate, which is this fun chess romance between these 2 really competitive players. It's really fun. I have it on my shelf over there. And it's fun because it made me want to get into chess. And in general, it is just a really cute little love story. And then I'd also recommend A Quiet Kind of Thunder, which is a lot less well known, but it's about this. It really explores disabilities and romance in a really unique way, basically. And for an adult romance, I don't actually think I've read that many. I really liked Beach Read by Emily Henry, but obviously that one's really well known. I thought it went really nice and in depth, and it was fun to read. And then combining those 2 genres with romantasy, which is one of my personal favourites, is kind of a new It's referred to as a newish genre, but it has been around for a while. For young adult, I would recommend The Throne of Glass by Sarah J. Maas, and it is such an incredible story. I'm so obsessed with it. You get this really unique main character who at first isn't maybe the most likable, but she definitely grows on you throughout the story. And this whole immersive world, it's just, there's so many plots happening at once and they all weave together in such a beautiful way. It is one of my favourite series ever. And then I'd also recommend The Prison Healer, which is about this girl who's as the name implies, a healer at this prison that once you're sentenced there is basically known as the last place you'll ever see. And you're kind of just following her. It's a series, and I've read the first 2 books and I really enjoyed both of them. However, I haven't gotten to the 3rd one yet. That's becoming a running theme here. I need to start finishing my series. And then for an adult one, for a more obscure recommendation, I'd recommend The House of Ash and Shadow, because it's kind of just a fun time sort of book. It might even classify as YA, I'm not sure. But I did enjoy it. The second book kind of lost me a bit, but the first one's really fun. And it's about this girl who cannot be touched without feeling immense pain. And then for the more common one, I know it's probably been recommended a million times, but I have to recommend Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros, because it is simply one of the greatest books ever. And it's basically about this girl named Violet who goes to this Dragon Rider Academy where you either graduate or you die. And there's lots of romance and it's really fun. There's fantasy elements, a really huge world. Only 2 books are out right now. The 3rd one's coming in January, but it's expected to be a 5-book series. So if you don't like reading series that aren't over yet, I would wait a bit before starting it. Okay, so for realistic fiction, for a middle grade book, I'd recommend The Girl with Space in Her Heart, which is this just simple coming of age story. But what I really love about this is that it has some poems just sprinkled throughout. It's not a poetry book, it's still mostly just a regular story, but it does have poetry written throughout, which I thought was really fun to read. And then I'd also recommend The Honeymoon Sisters, which is about these 2 girls who don't like each other at all at school, but then are forced to live together when the main character's mum is fostering the other girl. And it's fun dynamics, lots of banter, and a good time. For young adult, I'd recommend One, which is about these 2 I think they're called conjoined twins. And this book is written in verse, but I wouldn't let that put you off because it's still such a beautiful story. I wouldn't exactly call it poetry, it just is written in verse. However, it is really tragic, so maybe check trigger warnings for it. And then I would also do Welcome to Nowhere, which is this realistic fiction about a boy who is a refugee and he's escaping his home country. And again, it is quite a sad story, but it is also really beautiful and fun to read. And then I haven't actually read many adult realistic fictions. Some people call them literary fictions. I've just always called it realistic. But I really loved Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. And that has also become very popular. But is about this woman whose friend dies and she steals the manuscript that she was planning to publish and publishes it as her own. And then you're just following her and all the drama happens after. Next we have thriller, psychological, horror type books, and I haven't read many of these, but I really should because when I do read them I enjoy them quite a lot. For young adult, I'd recommend A Danger to Herself and Others. I've talked about this book a lot, and my video where I recommend books for people who want to be readers has a much more in-depth recommendation for this, but it is really fun. And then I'd also recommend The Girl with All the Gifts for an adult one. This one is a bit more gory and graphic, however it's still really fun, and it's about this girl who is treated as some sort of animal, and she's in this cell that she's been in her whole life, and all she knows is the cell and this little classroom school that happens. But it's definitely interesting. There's a mystery that happens about why she's like this. And yeah, it's just a really fun book. Speaking of mysteries, for mystery/murder mystery, I would recommend Murder Most Unladylike for a middle grade book. It does obviously have murder in it, hence the name. However, I still think it's okay for like 10 to 12-year-olds because it's funny and you get it in these two girls' perspective at this boarding school as someone is murdered and they want to pretend to be detectives and figure it out. It's quite a long series if you get into it, and there's even a follow-up series called The Ministry of Unladylike Activities or something. And in general, it's just a really easygoing mystery book. And then for young adults, I'd have to recommend A Good Girl's Guide to Murder. Finished this series recently, and I am completely obsessed with it. I actually really love the Netflix show as well, though I know lots of people are iffy about it. And it's about this girl called Pip who wants to solve the murder that happened 5 years ago. It's really just a mystery of the disappearance of this girl named Andy Bell. And no one really wants her to be solving this case because it's dredging up bad things from the past, but she's determined to solve it. Okay, for a genre I haven't really read much of, classics, I'm going to recommend Black Beauty, which is like middle grade young adult. And it's just a really beautiful story. It's really tragic, but it's such a beautiful story. And you're following this horse called Black Beauty just throughout the horse's life, but it isn't weird being in a horse's mind when you're in the story. It doesn't make you feel weird hearing a horse's thoughts. Like, it's easy to forget that your main character is not a human. And it's just a really interesting story. And then for an adult one, I'd recommend Rebecca, which is kind of this psychological chilling tale about this woman who marries this rich man and becomes obsessed with his dead ex-wife. There's a lot of questions going on about how she died and if he still loves her rather than the main character. And the plot twist at the end is one of the greatest horror classics I've ever read. I do want to read more classics though, so maybe in a future video, once I've read some more, I can recommend some different ones. Okay, next with dystopians, I have a really good, more obscure dystopian called The Children of Eden. And it is about this world where, so the world has ended, basically, because of like climate change, I think it was. And these people are in this dome called Eden, where there's a population rule, so you can't have more than one child so that they can sustain resources. But our main character is a twin who's been hidden her whole life. And this story is just such a roller coaster. It's a trilogy, and not only is it really inclusive, but it's also just a really unique book. And then for an adult recommendation, I haven't personally read this, but my friend has, and she really enjoyed it. It's really famous 1984 by George Orwell. And I don't know the plot that well, but I trust her recommendation because she really wants me to read it. And then for LGBT plus books, I'd recommend Loveless, which I actually recently reread, and it is just such an incredible story. It had me crying so many times, not from the sad parts, but from the happy parts, because it basically just explores all types of love, from platonic to queer to romance. It's just so beautiful, despite what the name implies about it, the main character being loveless, because she truly isn't. And I'd also recommend Imogen, obviously, which is kind of like a coming of age, coming out story. It's really fun though, and it's a kind of cringy because of the writing style, but it's still really good. And by the same author, Simon and the Homo Sapiens Agenda. That's also a really good one. They have a movie on Disney, I think, called Love, Simon, if you can't be bothered to read the book though. Next up, a genre I discovered quite recently, memoirs. I haven't read that many, but I really do enjoy them when I read them. I'd recommend I'm Glad My Mum Died, which was really popular last year, I think. And then the one that I read a while ago, I think I was 10 or 11, I read I Am Malala, and that is probably one of my favourite books ever. I've read this so many times, and it's definitely one of my favourite books. I don't really want to give too much away on these ones because it's hard to give like a summary. I just have to say, trust me, you should read these. Then for historical fiction, which in general I liked a lot more when I was younger, and now I just don't read as much of it because I tend to not like the older settings. However, I did really enjoy a middle grade book called Letters from the Lighthouse by Emma Carroll, I'm pretty sure. That's a really good one. And then for like an adult, probably an adult book, Where the Crawdads Sing. That's technically a historical fiction, but it also has romance and mystery elements. So that one's definitely a recommendation. And then, I don't know if this actually counts as a genre, but I've included dark academia because I know lots of people love that style of book. For a young adult one, I'd recommend Truly Devious, which is this dark academia mystery set at this dark boarding school in Vermont. And it's about this girl who's trying to solve a murder that took place like 50, 70, 60 something years ago. And I flew through this series in like a week, and there's 5 books, and these are like long books, so I'd definitely recommend these ones if you just want to get out of a slump or something. And then for adult, I'd recommend The Atlas Six, which is a bit more fantasy dark academia, about these 6 people who are invited to this magical academy. However, dark things start to happen, and they have to try to figure out why. That's very vague, but it's a very good story. And then lastly, for science fiction, I actually don't think I've read any science fiction because the idea of it, I think I started reading Iron Widow when I got bored, so I don't know if book science fiction's for me. However, I did really enjoy The Martian, which I think is also a book by Andy Weir. I watched the movie. So I'd recommend the story however you want to consume it. And that is all my recommendations. I hope there was something in here for you. And if you have any for me, I will definitely check them out if you put your recommendations in the comments. Please subscribe and like the video, and I'll see you in the next one.